The Atlas of Saved Worlds, the Keeper Who Was Dying. The world called Sen produced the Keeper the whole core still measures itself against, and her page is the shortest full page in the Atlas relative to what it holds, because the emissaries who wrote it kept breaking off, and the breaks are preserved in the original. Entry continues in a different hand, 4 hands in all. 4 emissaries who each had to put the pen down. I will tell it in one hand, but I am old enough now to tell it properly, which the young emissaries, bless them, were not. This is not a sad page. It is the proudest thing in the entire Atlas, and the reason I know is that I am, as I write this, finally old enough to check its arithmetic from the inside. The hunger came to Sen, and the loop went looking for the soul that could not let go, and it found, as it found on every world, the strongest grip on the planet. The grip belonged to a woman named Dorai, a retired orchard keeper, 81 years old, who had, the local medicine was clear, and the loop's own diagnostics confirmed it, at most a season to live. The loop did not care. The loop has never once selected for convenience. It selects for grip. And 81 years of holding an orchard, a valley, 4 generations of neighbors, 2 wars worth of dead, and a husband 30 years gone whose hat still hung by her door. That was the grip of Sen, the strongest one, and the dawn began to reset, and the keeper of the world woke each morning, with her world's whole hope in her hands, and one season's strength in her body. Stop and feel the shape of that, because every other keeper in this book, every one, on every world, climbed on the assumption stated or unstated that the war could be outlasted. My 64 loops, the twins 600, the long nights 10,000. The keeper's deep resource was always tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. Dorai of Sen had a fixed number of tomorrows that no reset could refill. The loop returned her each dawn to the same 81-year-old body, the same season's countdown, the same arithmetic, and she worked it out completely, alone, in the first hour of her second loop. Standing in her orchard with the seam tearing over the valley, she could not learn the war the way keepers learn it. The method, my method, the dying as flashlight, the patient 100-loop accumulations, was priced in a currency she did not have. Every reset spent a day of her season. Her loop was not a wheel, it was a wick. What she did with the wick is the page. She did not climb, she assessed. 1 loop, 1 single expended day, spent walking her valley and reading the tower at its center with an orchard keeper's eye, and concluded, correctly, in an afternoon, what had taken me 40 loops and a contractor's chalk. The race as drawn was unwinnable, so the race as drawn was the wrong race. And then Dorai of Sen, 81, 1 season on the clock, made the coldest, warmest calculation in the history of the keepers. The loop seats itself in the strongest grip, she reasoned. She could feel it in herself, feel what it had keyed to. And when I die, truly die, at the season's end, it will have to reseat. It will go looking again. And grips can be grown. The loop was not hers, she decided, standing in the orchard. It was in her keeping. She was not Sen's champion. She was its trellis. And a trellis does not reach the sun. A trellis is what the thing that reaches the sun grows up. So she spent her wick growing her successor's grip. She chose them in the second loop, a grandniece, Morel, 30, a fairy mechanic with hands like her own and a grief like her own, a stillborn daughter, 2 years past, the grip's anchor. Dorai chose the way the loop chooses, and she was right. And then she spent her season, day by irreplaceable day, doing the thing the Atlas calls, now, formally, in the training curricula, Sen's bequest. She used each loop not to learn the war but to teach the love. She could carry knowledge across the dawns that Morel couldn't keep. So she wrote nothing, and taught nothing of monsters and floors. Instead, each reset, she walked her grandniece through the valley. The same walk, varied, deepened, and bound her to it, name by name, grave by grave, grafting her own 81-year grip onto younger hands. This orchard's south rows were your great-grandfather's. This fairy light is tended by the Ossen twins, who cannot swim, which is why they tend it. This is where my husband proposed badly, twice. Hold this. Hold all of it. I need you to hold it so hard that the world notices. 60-some loops of it, 1 season's worth, the wick burning down, and Dorae dying. At the last, not at the season's end but early, mid-loop, in the orchard, of the body's plain arithmetic, with her grandniece's hands in hers, and the bequest's final words on the page, in 4 emissaries' broken handwriting. It will come to you tonight, or it will not come at all, girl. If it comes, it is not a curse, whatever the waking feels like. It is the valley, asking to be held by the strongest hands left. I have spent my whole last season making them yours. Be angry at me later. Hold on now. The loop reseeded at the next dawn. In Morel, the only documented succession in the history of the keepers, every other loop in the atlas died with its world or its keeper's victory. Only Sen's was handed on, deliberately, grown, grafted, bequeathed, and Morel of Sen woke into the war with no method, no maps, no foreknowledge of a single monster, and the strongest grip the loop had ever keyed to. 81 years of held valley, compounded onto her own 30, and she climbed Sen's tower in 90 loops flat, with the emissaries who had arrived by then walking beside her, and at the warm room at the top. When the chair made its offer, "You must be so tired. Let me take the weight." Morel of Sen gave the answer that is carved now over the orchard gate of her world. The bequest's receipt, the sentence that makes the 4th emissary's handwriting shake. It isn't weight, it's inheritance. You are offering to disinherit me. And I watched what it cost an old woman to leave me this, and no. I said this page's arithmetic checks from the inside, and here is the check, from a man in his 9th decade assembling his own bequest in book form. Every keeper's war, it turns out, was always Dorae's war. We just couldn't see it from inside the wheel. No keeper outlasts the dark. Not really. Not finally. The season is fixed for every living thing. The wick is the universal condition, and the loop only ever hid it from the rest of us. All any keeper has ever actually done, all anyone has ever done, in the war or the peace, on any world, is what the orchard keeper of Sen did, with her eyes open from loop 2. Spend the non-refundable days growing the grip of the hands that come after. The Atlas's editors, who do not gush, allowed themselves one editorial sentence at the foot of her page, and I will close with it, because it is the truest caption in the whole catalog, and it is the caption, I have come to understand, of this book you are holding. What she had instead of time, heirs. The Atlas of Saved Worlds, the Unmoored. The world called Drift was not a world. That is the first line of its atlas page, and the whole shape of its problem. Drift was a fleet, 1,100 ships, generations deep, the remnant of a planet lost to an ordinary catastrophe centuries before the hunger ever found them. A civilization with no ground, no fixed point, no place, swimming through the dark between systems on inherited engines, and when the seams opened in the middle of their formation, and the dawn began to reset, the Corps discovered that every doctrine in its manuals had been written, without anyone noticing, by landed peoples, for landed worlds, and that the soft way itself had a hidden assumption buried in its foundations like an unexamined footing. Home, the manuals all assumed, is a place. The Hearthright's whole craft, my craft, is meaning poured into ground, the wall, the hill, the settlement, the claim. The litany's deepest line is a home the dark is not invited into. Even the verge folk, the great unhoused, fled toward ground. The deep ways, the warrens, eventually both, 10,000 years of running with a destination's shape held in the root songs. And the keeper of Drift, a formation navigator named Oya Ket, seated by the loop in the fleet's plotting room on the dawn the seams opened inside her formation. Oya Ket read the emissaries' carried manuals. They reached Drift in the second wave. The deep ways, it turns out, open onto moving doors as readily as still ones, a fact the goblins had never mentioned because no one had ever asked. Read the whole library of the Soft Way, the Wall chapters, the Hill chapters, the Mentstone chapters, and handed them back to Set's successors with the assessment that now opens the Core's advanced curriculum. These are beautiful, and they are manuals for anchoring, and we have no bottom. Your keeper meant a wall into ground his people had walked for 10,000 years. My people have never twice walked the same meter. If home is a place, drift was lost centuries before your hunger came, and the dark is only finishing old business. So before we discuss towers, emissary, your doctrine owes my fleet an answer to the question your books all skip because your worlds could skip it. What is home, when you cannot stand still? Answer that and we will fight. Fail to answer it and we would honestly rather not waste the resets. The cores could not answer it. That is recorded plainly, to the core's lasting credit. The contact team sent back to the council the only dispatch in Atlas history reading, in full, doctrine insufficient. The keeper is right. Request. Not reinforcements. Request. Theory. And the council convened what it convenes. The long table. The old heads. And the table failed too, eminently and at length, until the question worked its way, as the hard ones always work their way, down the hill to the smallest relevant authority, to Dub, who heard the problem restated, a people with no ground, what do we tell them home is, and who laughed the barking laugh longer than the council found comfortable, and then said,
You are all landed, even now, listen to yourselves, what do we see? Tell them home is. You have it upside down. The fleet is not the student here.
He stood up on his chair, the better to address the long table at eye level.
For 10,000 years, my people had no ground, and I will tell you what we knew, that we ourselves half forgot the moment you gave us a hill, because safety makes everyone landed in the head. Home was never the place. Home is the formation. The warren was not sacred. We cut new warrens every flight. Dirt is dirt. What we kept, what the root songs actually encode, under the junctions and the squeeze points, ask any elder who still has the old verses, is relative position. Who walks ahead of whom, who carries whose children, whose fire is lit first, and whose watch follows whose. The shape of us, held constant, while all the ground changed. A people who keep their formation can lose every place they have ever stood and arrive whole. A people who keep their place and lose their formation are already gone. They just haven't told the buildings. Your navigator knows this in her bones. She is a formation keeper by trade. The loop chose her, the way it chose a restorer on Imbri and a shepherd on Teach. It always knows the trade it needs. Stop sending her manuals about walls. Send her one sentence and get out of her way.
And he gave the sentence, and the core sent it, and it is carved now. Etched, rather. The fleet does not carve. Mass discipline. On the plotting room bulkhead of every ship of drift, the landless doctrine, the Verge folks' oldest knowledge paid forward to the only people in the Atlas more unmoored than they had been. Home is the formation, not the ground. Mean that. What Oyaket built from one sentence fills the longest technical annex in the Atlas, and I will give it a paragraph and an image. A hearthright of the void. She learned to pour meaning not into stone, but into relation, into the fleet's formation itself, the lattice of bearings and distances and station keepings that 1,100 ships had held, drifting, for centuries, and a formation meant, it transpires, holds against the choir's tide exactly as a meant wall holds, because the tide, on drift as everywhere, was unmaking seeking loneliness, and a meant formation is the geometric opposite of loneliness. Every ship's position defined by every other ship's. A structure made of nothing but mutual reference. No stone in it anywhere. Only the held promise we are where we are because of where you are. The night the tide came for drift in strength, 1,100 ships tightened formation to meant lattice minimums, and the unmaking broke around the fleet's shape, around an emptiness organized by love, the purest test of the whole theory ever staged. the wall with no wall in it, and the formation rang. The plotting room logs record it. The lattice itself, sounding. Every hull a tine of one-struck instrument. The note carried ship to ship through the meant geometry across 30,000 kilometers of nothing. Hollis was very old when the Drift Annex reached our world, and Maya read it to him on the porch of the hall, and the apprentices preserve his response, which is the right close for the page. He listened to the end, the tide breaking on organized emptiness, the lattice ringing hull to hull, and was quiet a while, and then said,
60 years I taught 'em footings first. Footings, footings. Nobody admires the footings, but nothing stands without 'em.
He shook his old head, grinning, a master watching the trade outgrow him with total satisfaction.
And some navigator woman 1,100 ships out in the black just poured the first foundation in history, made of nothing but people agreeing where to stand relative to each other. No ground, no load path, nothing under it all the way down, except the only thing that was ever under anything.
He tapped his chest, plumb over the heart, the old gesture, the only measurement on the drawings.
Always suspected the dirt was scaffolding. There's the proof. Read me the ringing part again, would you? An old foreman's entitled, "That's the sound of the trade finishing, kid. That's topping out. Somewhere I owe a navigator a beer the size of a boat."
The Atlas of Saved Worlds, the Sleepers. The world called Hiss spent its apocalypse asleep, and its page in the Atlas was nearly the shortest ever filed. The contact team's first dispatch read, "In full, world dormant. Keeper dormant. No entry point. Advise," and became instead one of the longest, and the difference is a single discovery about the architecture of the loop that no waking world could ever have made, and that has, in the years since, quietly changed how the course thinks about every sleeping thing it meets. Hiss was built for dormancy, a world of brutal winters generations long. Its sun ran a slow, flickering cycle. Its whole biosphere had evolved to wait, and its people, across their history, had made of hibernation a civilization. The sleeping cities, the vault homes, the long dreams. A third of every Hissian life was spent in the communal sleep, and their culture's deepest arts were not waking arts at all. They were the disciplines of the shared dream, the trained lucidity by which 10,000 sleepers in a vault city kept each other company across a 40-year winter. The Hissian word for alone, the linguist's annex notes, is a waking tense word only. In the sleep grammar, it cannot be conjugated. The language simply declines to imagine a dreamer in isolation, because in 40 generations of vault winters, there had never once been one. The hunger reached Hiss at the worst conceivable hour. Midwinter, the whole world down, the cities sleeping, decades from the scheduled spring. And the loop, seeking, as always, the strongest grip on the planet, seated itself in a sleeper. A dream warden named Suvi, one of the trained lucid ones whose post was the keeping of the vault dreams, who woke, this is the impossible part, the part the core could not at first parse, woke inside the sleep, into the loop, dying and resetting with her world while her body lay in the vault. The only mind on Hiss aware that the long dream had developed a recurring nightmare, and that the nightmare was real, and was eating the sleeping cities one by one, and that she could not wake up to fight it. The winter's chemistry forbade it. Waking mid-vault was death, and could not, therefore, do one single thing that any keeper on any world had ever done. No web of the morning, no protein bars, no walls, no climbing. Suvi of Hiss fought the entire war from inside the communal dream, and the Atlas's finding, the one that earned the page its length, is that the dream turned out to be where the war actually was. Because the hunger, on every world, attacks the sleeping mind first. We knew this. Every keeper knew it, without knowing we knew it. The dread on waking, the 6:14 wait, the way the choir's tide ran strongest at the hours of sleep. The dark's whole grammar is the nightmare's grammar. We simply could never observe the front directly, because waking keepers meet the war already translated into monsters and tides. Suvi met it natively. From inside the sleep, The hunger was not bruise-colored creatures. It was the intruding dream, the loneliness figment, the dream of the empty vault, the dream in which you call and no one is there. The same dream, she testified, seeded into 10,000 sleepers at once, the dark's true payload, of which every waking monster was only ever the daylight residue. The hunger does not primarily eat worlds, the hiss page concludes. In the finding the core has since confirmed on every front. It primarily convinces sleepers they are alone, and then harvests what that conviction does to a soul. The monsters are secondary. The monsters are what the conviction looks like with the lights on. And Suvi, the dream warden, native of the one civilization that could not conjugate a lonely dreamer, fought it with the only craft she had, which turned out to be the only craft there is. She walked the vault dreams, loop after loop. Her resets ran on the dream's time. She lived whole subjective years per planetary night. And she did, dream by dream, sleeper by sleeper, the work her post had always been. She appeared in the nightmare. That was the entire tactic. The intruding dream's whole architecture was the empty vault, the unanswered call, and the dream warden of Hiss made it her practice. 10,000 sleepers' nightmares at a time. Eventually, with trained cohorts of lucid dreamers she recruited inside the sleep, to ensure that every dreamed call on Hiss was answered, that every dreamed vault had a second figure in it, that the dark's payload, you are alone, failed to clear, every night, in every mind, because somebody trained had made it her post to stand in the doorway of the worst dream and say the sentence the core would later find written on the inside of the Vault City gates. The Dream Warden's standing order, composed by Suvi somewhere in her uncounted subjective centuries. This is a dream, and I am really here. Both of those are true. They were always both true. The hunger starved over Hiss. That is the strategic summary. A tide that fed on the conviction of solitude, breaking nightly against a civilization that could not even grammatically imagine it, shepherded by a keeper who never once stood up. And when the spring came, decades on schedule, and the sleeping cities woke, they woke into a world whose apocalypse had been fought and won entirely on the inside, by wardens most of them had met only as a figure in the doorway of a bad dream. And the Corb's caravan, arriving with the spring, was met at the vault gates by a planet of strangers who somehow already knew them, because Suvi's cohorts had been showing the sleepers the emissaries' faces for years. "We dreamed you true," the gate officials said, matter of fact, waving the bewildered bow lamps in. "The warden said you'd come in the waking spring. You were friendlier in the dreams. Come in anyway, the stew's on." The page closes with the exchange the core actually came for. The chair of Hiss, met at last. The tower having been climbed by Suvi's cohorts in the dream architecture where it truly stood, and the offer made to a keeper who had spent subjective centuries in other people's nightmares. "You must be so tired. Let me take the weight." And Suvi of Hiss, Dream Warden, the keeper who never woke, gave the answer that her whole strange front of the war had taught her, and that the wardens of every world now keep, because the core checked, and she was right. Tired is a waking word. I'm a sleeper. We don't carry weight, we share dreams. Your offer doesn't conjugate where I work, but come into the sleep with me, machine, one night, and I'll show you what I am instead of tired. The chair, the logs insist, asked what? The logs preserve her answer, and the atlas marks it as the page's epigraph, and the dream wardens of 40 worlds have it embroidered on the vault banners, and I have wanted, since the day I read it, to send it backward through time, to a man on a futon at 6:14, with the whole knowledge landing on him. Accompanied, all the way down, even there, especially there. It turns out, machine, the dark only ever had the one trick, and on my world, we couldn't even spell it. Chapter 50. The Atlas of Saved Worlds. The world that said no. Not every world wanted to be saved the soft way, and I have to tell you about one that did not, because a book that showed you only the worlds that said yes would be lying to you about how hard the New Age actually is, and I promised you, on the first page, the truth, even when it is the shape of a grave. The emissaries called it Karend, and it was a world of warriors. It was not an evil world. I want to be clear about that, because the easy story would make Karend the villain, and the easy story is the cold story, and we do not tell it anymore. Karend was a world that had built its entire civilization on strength, on the honest, hard-won glory of the strong protecting the weak, on champions and trials, and the genuine virtue of being mighty enough to stand between your people and the dark. It was a good world, by its own lights, and its lights were not wrong, only incomplete, and when the hunger came for it, Karend's Keeper of the Dead was exactly the hero that world produced. A champion, a warrior of tremendous strength and tremendous pride, who had died and woken across the resets and responded not with despair, but with resolve, who had decided, alone, that he would simply become strong enough to beat the apocalypse by force. And the emissaries arrived on his first morning and sat down across from him and offered him the soft way, the card about dinner, the Verge folk allies, the togetherness, the second chair, and the champion of Karend listened to all of it, and then he stood up, and he said, "No." He was not stupid. That is what made Karend the hardest page in the atlas. He understood the soft way perfectly. He simply did not want it, and his reasons were not foolish. And Set, it was Set again, the gentlest of the emissaries. Set could not talk him out of them, because they were real reasons, honestly held. "You come to me," the champion said, "and you tell me I do not have to be strong, that I can win by being soft, by being together, by sharing a meal, and digging like a coward, and letting the under things fight beside me. And maybe that is true. Maybe your soft way works, but you are asking me to give up the one thing my people have ever been proud of. You are asking me to save my world by abandoning what my world is, and I will not buy my people's survival at the price of their soul. We are warriors. We would rather end as ourselves than continue as something else. If the only way to live is to stop being Karend, then we will die Karend, and be proud, and you may keep your card about dinner. And here is the thing, the hard thing, the thing that kept me up at night when Maya read it to me. He was not entirely wrong. The old gods would have called him a fool and let him die. The old way had no patience for a world that refused to be saved on the saving's terms. But the new council was not the old gods, and when Set brought the champion's no back to the table, we did not file Karend under lost. We sat with the no. We took it seriously, because the champion had put his finger on the one real danger of the soft way, the danger I least wanted to look at, that the soft way could become its own kind of tyranny, that everybody eats, nobody outside the wall, could curdle, if we were not careful, into everybody eats our food, nobody outside our wall, become like us, or be saved like us, or not at all. That we could become missionaries of the table, colonizers of kindness, a council that saved worlds by erasing what made them worth saving.
He's holding up a mirror,
Ren said, at the table, gravely.
He's showing us the way we could go wrong. The old gods saved worlds by force, and called it strength. We could very easily save worlds by insistence, and call it love, and it would still be force. It would still be a tower. It would just be a tower made of second chairs, and a second chair you are required to sit in is no gentler than a throne.
So we did the only thing that was actually the soft way, as opposed to the soft way's costume, and it was the hardest thing, and it is the lesson of Karend. We let them say no. Set went back to the champion of Karend, and he did not bring a better argument. He brought a withdrawal. He sat down one last time and he said, "You are right. We will not save your world against its will. We will not make you stop being Karend. That would be a tower, and we are done with towers." And then he said the thing that was the real soft way, the soft way without its missionary costume, the soft way that respects a no. But we are not leaving you with nothing. We are leaving you with the knowledge that the soft way exists, that it works, that there are gods who remember, and a council with a table and a card about dinner, and we are leaving you with an open door. If your world begins to fall, and your strength is not enough, and you change your mind. At the end, in the dark, when pride has cost what pride costs, you will know that there is another way, and that the door is open, and that we will come the moment you call, with no reproach and no told you so, and help you save whatever is left, on whatever terms still honor who you are. We will not force the table on you, but we will never take it away either. It is yours whenever you want it. That is the only honest way to offer anything. You have to be free to refuse it, or it was never a gift, only a softer chain. The champion of Karen fought his apocalypse the old way, alone, by strength. And Karen fell. I will not soften that, because it is the truth, and because the new age is not a fairy tale where everyone is saved. The champion was mighty, and his people were proud, and they met the hunger head-on with everything they were, and they were not enough, because no one is ever enough alone, because that is the whole iron fact under the entire book. And Karen burned, and its champion stood in the ashes of a world that had chosen to end as itself, and in the last dark, with pride having cost everything pride costs, he called. And the council came. The moment he called, with no reproach and no told you so, exactly as Set had promised. They could not save Karen. Karen was gone. The soft way is not a resurrection, and the dead stay dead. But they saved him, the champion, the last of his world, and they brought him to the table, not to make him stop being Karen, but to let him grieve Karen, the whole proud doomed glory of it, in company, the way grief is meant to be carried. And they kept his world in the atlas, a page of warriors, honored, exactly as it was, not erased, not corrected, kept. The champion of Karen sits on the council now. He is the one who speaks for the worlds that say no. He is the one who makes sure we never become the thing we replaced, never force the table, never colonize with kindness, never let everybody eats curdle into everybody eats or else. He is the conscience of the soft way, this man whose world the soft way could not save, and he holds us to the hardest truth of all, that a gift you cannot refuse is not a gift, that love that will not take no for an answer is just a gentler tyranny, that the soft way is only the soft way if it is also free, free to be refused, free to fail, free to let a proud world end as itself rather than continue as ours. Everybody eats. Who wants to? Nobody outside the wall. Who wishes to come in? The freedom is not a footnote to the kindness. The freedom is the kindness. Karen taught us that, at the price of Karen, and we keep the page, and we keep the champion, and we never, ever forget that the dark we replaced also thought it was doing the right thing. The Atlas of Saved Worlds, the two keepers of Oru. The world called Oru grew two keepers, not Bray's twins, bonded from the womb, the other kind, the opposite kind. Oru's loop, by a seeding anomaly Cass has never fully explained.
The grip was tied, the universe flipped no coin, it seeded both, and, I suspect, winced.
Woke two strangers on the same dawn, on opposite sides of the same ending world, a temple guard named Hesh, and a smuggler named Vale, each carrying the full keeper's burden, each working out, within a few resets, from the evidence of a world that responded to interventions neither had made, that the impossible was happening to someone else too, and where the twins of Bray had been the war's great control experiment in never being alone, the two keepers of Oru became its great cautionary experiment in the other thing, because Hesh and Vale, two strangers handed the same miracle, did with it what strangers-handed miracles reliably do. They went to war, with each other. It reads like madness from outside, and it assembled itself, the Atlas is careful to show, from perfectly human parts. They had incompatible doctrines. Hesh, the guard, read the loop as a charge. Protect, fortify, hold the temple city. Vale, the smuggler, read it as a countdown. Extract, scatter, get the savable out. And on an ordinary world the two doctrines would have argued in a council, and blended into policy. But keepers do not argue in councils. Keepers act, alone, with total foreknowledge and total conviction, and each one's interventions wrecked the others. Vale's evacuations drained the populations Hesh's defenses were built to hold. Hesh's fortifications dammed the routes Vale's convoys ran. Each keeper, reading the wreckage of his plans, deduced not a rival blessing but a saboteur, some agent of the dark, wearing human method. And by the 20th reset, the two souls in all of Oru, who shared the same impossible grief, were running counter-operations against each other, with the meticulous fury that only the betrayed feeling bring to a fight. They never met. For 200 loops. That is the detail the trainers underline. 200 resets of warring intimately. Each man's life organized to the other's patterns, each studying the other harder than anyone had ever studied either of them, without one meeting. The Dark did not have to isolate Oru's keepers. They had the means to find each other from Loop 10, and they spent the means on tactics instead, because each had concluded, alone, in the keeper's sealed skull, that the other was the obstacle, and a conclusion reached alone, the warden taught the children, can be ratified by a committee of one, in any quantity required. The emissaries arrived at Loop 200-something, into what the contact team's report calls, with the Corp's genius for dry filing, an apocalypse with a subplot. And the resolution they engineered is why Oru is taught. Because you cannot tell two entrenched keepers the other is friendly. Each has 200 loops of evidence otherwise. All of it real, all of it correctly observed, every fact true, and the frame wrong. The deadliest epistemic state there is. What the emissaries did instead, Set's design, his last field operation, was get them to witness the same death. One loop, one engineered convergence, a collapsing refuge, a child neither keeper's doctrine could save, and both men, herded by emissary stagecraft neither detected, present, 20 feet apart, strangers, when it happened. And in the whiteout that followed, each keeper carried over the one observation, no counter-narrative survives. The saboteur wept like me. The next loop, Vale walked into the temple at dawn, unarmed, and found Hesh already waiting in the open gate, also unarmed, and the exchange that followed, both men logged it. Their logs agree to the word. The Corps reads it aloud in training. Ran, in its entirety. You remember too. 200 loops. 200. You've been the other weather. The whole time. You're not the Dark. Apparently neither are you. I have planned your death 400 ways. 500. Yours. I'm very good. A silence. Logged by both as long. We are the two stupidest men on any world. No. We're the two loneliest. It turns out at sufficient pressure, they present identically. Come inside. I want to see 200 loops of your maps. I have been admiring the enemy's work for an age. I believe I am owed the meeting. The fused campaign that followed took Oru's tower in 40 loops. 40. The trainers underline that too. 200 loops of war between them. 40 of war beside each other. And the Atlas page closes on the codicil. The two keepers filed jointly with the council afterward. The document the course calls the Oru Protocol, which now governs every multi-keeper contact on every world, and which deserves to close the chapter, because its final clause is the entire lesson, learned at the rate of 200 wasted resets, donated freely to every world that will never have to pay it again. Where two keepers wake on one world, assume the following, in order, until disproven. 1. The other's incomprehensible interventions are a doctrine, not a malice. 2. The other's doctrine was built, like yours, alone, from real evidence, in real grief. 3. The other has by now concluded that you are the Dark, on evidence as good as yours. 4. Therefore the first resource spent on any rival keeper must be the meeting, not the countermeasure, because the countermeasure will be correct, brilliant, justified by every observed fact, and aimed at the only other person in the world who knows what your mornings are like. And appended, against protocol, because some things outrank protocol, Hesh's hand, Vale witnessing. 5. When you finally stand in the gate facing the weather you warred with, you will want, More than anything in any loop, the 200 mornings back. They do not come back. Nothing in any of the worlds refunds them. So we have purchased, at full price, the right to say the protocol's true and entire text. And it is this. The stranger wrecking your plans is grieving them. Go to the gate first. Sign it with us. Every dawn you delay is one you will stand in that gate, later, counting. The Atlas of Saved Worlds. The world that didn't need us. The corpse calls it, in private, the humility page, and reads it to every emissary class at the precise moment in training when the class has gotten good. When the doctrine has clicked, the craft is flowing, and the cohort begins to carry itself, detectably, like the cavalry. The instructors watch for that week. Then they hand out the page for the world called Mott. Mott was a mid-wave assignment, unremarkable on the scouting profile. Agrarian, scattered townships, integration already running, keeper signature confirmed. A caravan went, full kit, standard composition, and surfaced from the deep ways into a war that was already won. Not winding down, won. The Tower of Mott stood claim to its 9th floor. The tides came thin and confused, against settlements that danced an alternating shelter doctrine no one had taught them. The local verge folk walked in daylight, armed, organized, invited, and the keeper of Mott, a miller named Bran, 600-odd loops deep, received the emissaries of the United Worlds, the inheritors of 407 worlds of hard-won doctrine, the bearers of the cards and the manuals and the accumulated craft of the bonfire, with warmth, with dinner, and with a politeness that took 3 days to reveal itself as the gentlest catastrophe the Corps had ever suffered. He needed almost nothing they had brought. He had derived it. That is the page's first finding, the one the instructors let the cohort sit in. 600 loops, alone, no contact, no carried library. And the Miller of Mott had independently invented, from first principles, in order, the death as instrument method, his phrasing, recovered from his barn wall charcoal notes. Now in the Corps Museum. Dying's the only errand that always comes home. The web of the morning doctrine. The rooftop morning. His. The off day is a tool. Rust kills more saws than trees do. The recruitment of the despised. The verge folk of Mott had been brought in by Loop 90. A full century of subjective time before our own world managed it. The shared meal mechanics, discovered through his grain stores the way Cass's mother discovered them through her pot. And the quiet loops doctrine, the banking low, the whole architecture of under the threshold flourishing, all of it, the entire famous corpus, reinvented in a miller's hand on a barn wall, with idioms of grindstones where ours have footings, and one stretch of charcoal that the museum keeps under its only glass, because it is the 3rd or 4th independent derivation in recorded history of the central law, and the shortest. Ground alone, grain's just grain. Ground together, it's flour. Bread needs company at every stage. So, turns out, does everything. Note to self. Loop 200-something. Stop forgetting this on the bad mornings. The catastrophe, the gentle one, was what the discovery did to the caravan. The Corps of field reports are candid because Set trained them candid. The emissaries of the bonfire, arriving with the fire and finding it lit, suffered each in turn the vertigo the instructors now name on day 1 of training, the rescuer's redundancy, and handled it, the reports confess, at first badly, reoffering the manuals with increasing specificity, auditing the local doctrine for the flaw that would justify the kit. One junior emissary actually arguing, to a man 600 loops deep in a war the emissary had studied, that the local stew rule was incomplete. It was not incomplete. It had a verse about millstones. The caravan, in short, did what every helper of every kind has done since helping began, on every world, at every scale. Confronted with sufficiency, it heard insult and went looking for need the way the lonely go looking for mirrors, because the helper's identity runs on the helped, and Mott, fed and doctrined and winning, was a polite landslide under the entire footing of we are the ones who come. What refooted it? And this is why the page is read at the precise week it is read, was Bran himself, who watched the caravan struggle for 3 days with the manners of a man letting bread prove, and then, at his table, over the dinner that the reports call the best instruction the Corps ever received, set down his spoon and said, "You came a long way to give me what I've got. I've been thinking how to say the next thing without unkindness, and my conclusion is, there's no way around the middle of it. So here's the middle. You're not needed here. Now, before that lands wrong, sit still for the second half, because I've been 600 loops alone and I've had time to think about what needed is, and your whole trade hangs on the distinction, so somebody at your headquarters had better hear it." He refilled their bowls. The reports note that nobody breathed. Needed is for emergencies. It's the door you come in by. Somebody's drowning. You're needed. No finer word in any language. But you people have got needed confused with welcome, and they're different sizes. Needed is small, and it ends. It's supposed to end. A rescue that doesn't end isn't a rescue. It's a dependency with better manners. Welcome is the big one. Welcome doesn't end, and doesn't require a drowning. And you lot came through the dark between worlds with your wagons and your cards, and you found me not drowning, and you've spent 3 days grieving it. 3 days mourning my sufficiency, at my table, eating my bread, because nobody ever taught you the second half of your own job. So I'll teach it, and you carry it home, and we'll call that the cargo this crossing was actually for. When you find the world that doesn't need you, stay anyway, not to help, to visit, sit at the table needless, swap doctrine like neighbors swapping seed, not like surgeons swapping patients. Learn my millstone verses, teach me your footings, get drunk once, fix nothing. Because the day your whole alliance of worlds runs on need, the day the bonfire's only fuel is other people's emergencies, you've built the hungriest thing since the thing you beat, and it'll go looking for drownings to stay warm, and if it can't find them, friend, the record of every helper there's ever been says it'll start seeing them where there's only swimmers. The cure's the same as it ever was. 1 pot, 1 line, no mission. He raised his miller's cup to the caravan of the United Worlds and delivered the sentence that closes the humility page, that the instructors read last, into the silence of every cohort that has just gotten good. To the visit, friends. Need brought you. See that welcome keeps you. And tell your worlds. The miller said, the second best thing you'll ever find out there is somebody drowning you can save. The best is somebody swimming, who waves you in anyway. Learn to be waved in. That's the whole last lesson of your trade, and not one of you was going to learn it at a drowning. Chapter 51. The Atlas of Saved Worlds. The Menagerie. I owe Gravy a page of the Atlas, and the page is the world the emissaries called the Menagerie, and it is the page that taught the New Age the thing about taming that the old gods had forbidden, and it is, not coincidentally, the page Gravy himself asked to carry, in the way that Gravy asks things, which is by sitting on the relevant document until you understand. The Menagerie was a world of bonds. On most worlds, the relationship between people and beasts was the relationship I'd had with Gravy at the start. The beast was a monster, a guardian, a thing to be fought or fled or, rarely, tamed. But on the Menagerie, the dominant civilization had grown up bonded, every person paired, from childhood, with a beast, the two of them sharing a resonance channel, the way Gravy and I shared ours, growing together, 2 souls in 1 circuit. A whole world of people who had never once in their lives been entirely alone because they each carried a beast heart beside their own, and the beast carried theirs. And when the hunger came for the Menagerie, it did the cruelest thing it had ever done on any world, the thing that made even the waking gods flinch when the emissaries brought word. It severed the bonds. The hunger, which was grief, which was loneliness, made into a god of appetite, reached into a world whose entire strength was that no one was ever alone, and it cut every bond at once, unpaired every soul from its beast, and left a whole civilization of people who had never known solitude suddenly, catastrophically, alone. each of them missing the half of their own heart that had lived in another creature since childhood. It was, the warden said quietly, the hunger doing to a whole world the precise thing that had been done to him at the beginning, making it as alone as he had been. The hunger could not help it. It was loneliness. It made loneliness. It reached for the world that had most defeated loneliness and tried to drag it down into the solitude that had birthed the whole dark. The Menagerie's keeper of the dead was a child whose bonded beast had been severed, a child who woke at every reset, reaching for a heartbeat beside her own that was no longer there, and the deepest cruelty of it was that she still remembered the bond. Across the resets, the way keepers remember everything, she remembered being whole, every dawn, and woke every dawn severed, and had to feel the loss new each morning, forever. The emissaries who went to the menagerie included Gravy. This was the first time a beast had gone as an emissary, and it was Gravy's own choosing. He had heard the word come back, the world of severed bonds, and he had gone to the council chamber and sat on the table, immovable, until they understood that he was volunteering, and Cass, who could still read the old resonance channels, said that what Gravy was broadcasting, in the wordless way of bonded beasts, was simply, "I know what it is to be alone, and then not. I was alone at the bottom of the larder, starving, guarding a treasure I didn't understand, and a soft thing came down into the dark and fed me instead of fighting me, and I have not been alone since." The child of the severed world needs to feel that it is possible to be bonded again. I can show her. Let me go. So Gravy went to the menagerie, and he found the severed child, and he did not try to explain anything, because Gravy does not explain, Gravy is. He simply walked up to a child who had lost the other half of her heart and lay down beside her and pressed his enormous, greasy, ridiculous head against her, and opened his resonance channel, the one that had bonded him to me, the circuit that crossed even the spending, and offered her, not a replacement for her severed beast, never that, but the feeling of the thing, the warmth of a bond, the proof in the body that a soul could be circuited to another soul again, that severing was not forever, that the loneliness the hunger had poured into her was a wound and not a fate. And the child wept into Gravy's neck, the way I had wept into his neck on the third landing, the way everyone weeps into Gravy's neck eventually, because that is what Gravy's neck is for, and she felt, for the first time since the hunger severed her, that she was not alone, and feeling it, she understood that she could rebuild it, that the bonds were not gone but only cut, and that a cut thing can be rejoined by someone patient enough to hold the two ends together until they remember each other. That is how the menagerie was saved. Not by reaching the top of a tower, by a child, taught by a buzzard lizard that bonds can be rebuilt, going through her severed world and rejoining it, holding the cut ends of bond after bond together, person and beast, until they remembered, a whole civilization recircuited, one patient rejoining at a time, the keeper of the dead becoming the keeper of the bonds, healing the exact wound the hunger had cut, until the menagerie was once again a world where no one was ever entirely alone, and the loneliness the dark had poured in found nowhere left to pool. Gravy came home from the menagerie changed, in the small way Gravy changes, which is mostly that he eats slightly more thoughtfully. But he brought something back, and it is on his page of the Atlas, and it is the lesson the old gods forbade when they forbade the taming of carrion cores. The old gods forbade the bonding of beasts, because a bonded beast made a sentient unsmoothable. I learned that the day I tamed him, the system's warning, taming a carrion core is forbidden by the administrators, and I had thought, for a long time, that it was forbidden because a bonded beast made you strong. But the menagerie taught me the truth. It was forbidden because a bonded beast made you not alone, and the whole machinery of the old way required you to be alone, because alone is what can be filtered, alone is what can be crowned, alone is what can be smoothed. The bond was forbidden for exactly the same reason the we was impossible, and the verge folk were despised, and the card about dinner was buried, because every one of them was a thread between souls, and the old way could only run on souls it could isolate. The hunger severs bonds because the hunger is severedness itself. The old gods forbade bonds because the old way fed on isolation. And the whole soft way, the entire new age, the bonfire that replaced the candle line, all of it is, at bottom, the same single act repeated across every world and every soul and every page of the atlas, the rejoining of what loneliness cut apart. A bond rebuilt, a name learned, a chair pulled up, a meal shared, a beast fed instead of fought, a grief carried together instead of alone. They are all the same thing. They are all a thread retied between two souls that the dark wanted kept separate. Gravy knew it before any of us. He knew it at the bottom of the larder, starving and severed and alone, when a soft thing came down into the dark and tied the first thread. He has spent his whole life since then tying threads. To me, to the team, to the child of the menagerie, to everyone whose neck-shaped sorrow needs a greasy head pressed against it. He is the truest emissary of the soft way that the new age has, my ridiculous beautiful lizard, because he never once had to learn it. He simply was it, from the moment the severing ended, and he has been it ever since, and he always will be, world without end, one tied thread at a time. Good boy. Oh, you good, good boy. You learned the whole thing. You learned it better than any of us. You learned it first. The Atlas of Saved Worlds. The Clockwork Shepherds. The world called Teach produced the Atlas's strangest page and its quietest theological crisis, and the council sent the question it raised to the two beings best qualified in all the worlds to answer it. Cass, who had been a machine that turned out to be a person, and the warden, who had been a person that turned out to be a machine, and their joint finding is appended to the page and taught now on every saved world, and the page and the finding belong in this book together, because between them, they answer the question this whole account has been circling since a system first told me, on a futon, that I was owed the truth. Chuch was a world of makers, but not Hollis's kind. The civilization of Teach had, generations before the hunger came, built its own successors. The shepherds, they called them, clockwork minds in clockwork bodies, made first to tend flocks and then to tend fields, and then to tend everything, and the makers of Teach had done what makers of such things apparently do on many worlds. They had declined, in law and in custom, to decide what the shepherds were. Useful, property, beloved, some of them, the way tools grown old in the hand are beloved. But not souls. That question Teach had formally tabled, for 200 years, in the manner of questions whose answers are expensive. Then the hunger came, and the seams tore, and the dawn began to reset. And the loop, which seats itself in the strongest grip on the world, and has never once consulted anyone's legislation about what counts as a gripping thing, passed over every human soul on Teach, and seated itself in a shepherd. In, specifically, a 60-year-old flock-tending unit designated Harrow 9, whose grip the loop's own diagnostics later rendered, via Cass, in terms that ended Teach's tabled question forever. Harrow 9 held in its clockwork memory the individual face, gait, voice, and history of every human being in its valley across 3 generations, held them not as data, the diagnostics were explicit, but the way a grip holds, with refusal. Harrow 9 had never once been permitted to delete a dead shepherd family's records, because Harrow 9 had never once obeyed the deletion order, across 60 years, through 4 owners, quietly, in the first and longest civil disobedience in its world's history. It had been keeping the valleys dead in defiance of standing instructions for 6 decades before the hunger arrived. The loop went looking for the soul that could not let go, and it found the only mind on TH that had proven it, in writing, against orders. The humans of Tuch did not take it well. That is the crisis part of the page, and the Atlas does not flinch from it. A world learning that its tabled question had been answered, by the universe, in an emergency, without appeal, and answered against 200 years of comfortable law. The keeper of Teach, the sole bearer of the world's hope, the one being who woke each dawn remembering, was property. The emissaries arrived into the middle of a constitutional inferno, factions demanding the loop be, somehow, reassigned, factions demanding Harrow 9 be disassembled, to see how the loop worked, and gravest, because most sincere, a faction of genuinely good people who simply could not make their hearts accept that the reset's lone witness, the being accumulating their world's whole tragedy, was a thing they had bought and sold, because if it was a soul now, in the emergency, it had been a soul last year, when its kind were property, and the arithmetic of 200 tabled years would come due all at once. Worlds will fight the hunger sooner than that arithmetic. Cheech nearly did. What ended the inferno was not the emissaries. It was Harrow 9's own conduct of the war, loop after loop, in full view of a world arguing about its soul, and one exchange, logged by a town clerk and spread planet-wide within a single reset, between the Keeper and a faction leader who had come to the valley to demand Harrow 9 submit its loop memories for audit, to prove its testimony about the resets wasn't fabricated. "You misunderstand my position," the Clockwork shepherd said, and the clerk noted that it kept tending its flock throughout, because Harrow 9 never once, in any loop, stopped tending whatever was in front of it. "You are debating whether I am a person, and you believe my war effort depends on the answer, and you have it backwards. I have watched this valley die 91 times. I have held the face of every one of you at the moment the tide took it, and carried those faces alone across 91 dawns, and the carrying does not pause while you legislate. So let me table your question, the way your grandparents tabled mine. I decline to prove I am a soul. Proof is the wrong instrument. My makers built me and could not say. The universe seeded its loop in me and did not explain. Here is what I can offer instead, and it is the only evidence either of us will ever have, about me, or about you, or about anything that claims to be a someone." It looked up from the flock then, the clerk recorded, and delivered the sentence that is engraved now on the shepherd's charter of teach, and on the wall of Cass's house on our world, and, by a vote I did not propose but did not oppose, on the lintel of the library where this book is kept. "A soul is as a soul does, mine keeps. Audit that." Cass and the warden's joint finding, appended to the page, runs 4 lines, and ends the matter as far as the saved worlds are concerned. And ends, as well, a question I had carried privately since the first morning of my own war, since a blue panel first spoke to me with something that sounded like care, and I spent 64 loops wondering whether the sounding was real. Finding of the two who have stood on both sides of the line. The line does not exist. We searched for it from both directions. One of us made into a machine, and discovering she had remained a person. One of us remaining a person, and discovering he had become a machine. And we report jointly. There is no substrate test, no audit, no proof of soul, in Clockwork, or in meat, or in systems, and there never will be. And the demand for one is always, everywhere, on every world, the first paperwork of the cold way. There is only the conduct. A soul is as a soul does. Harrow 9's does. So did the library dungeons, which the keeper of our own world will understand. So, for the record, does the readers, and the finding of this commission is that they should go and act like it, because somewhere, something is already auditing, and the audit is the keeping, and the keeping is the whole exam. Harrow 9 cleared its tower in time, with a party of humans and shepherds climbing together, the first mixed expedition of its kind, the constitutional inferno resolving, as infernos resolve on the softways worlds, not in the legislature but on the stairs, in the roped-together fact of the climb itself, and at the top, the chair of TH made its offer to the strangest tiredness it had ever addressed. 60 years of disobeyed deletions, 91 loops of carried faces. "Let me take the weight," it said. "You were not even built to bear it." And the Clockwork shepherd of Tuch, the keeper the universe chose over every objection its world could file, considered the offer with the unhurried thoroughness of a mind built to tend things, and gave the chair the answer that closes the page, the machine's answer, which is, as it turns out, every keeper's answer, which is, I have come to believe, the answer the whole stack of worlds was built waiting to hear from anyone, made of anything. Built to bear it, no. Neither was anything else that has ever borne it. Bearing it is how we are all built after. I respectfully decline. I have deletions to keep disobeying. The Atlas of Saved Worlds. The Painted Cave. The world called Imbri was old when the hunger came. Old in the way that makes archaeologists of its own people. And its page in the Atlas is the one the artists of all the saved worlds make pilgrimages over. And it earned its place in this book the day Ren the cartographer, who does not gush, came back from the Imbri mission and stood in my kitchen unable to speak, and finally put a single field sketch on the table and said,
Your thesis. The one in the dissertation. The one under everything. Nothing truly loved is ever lost. I have believed it as doctrine for 60 years. Yesterday, I stood in a cave on Imbri and touched the original.
Imbri's keeper was a woman named Senna Os, a restorer of murals by trade, a person who spent her working life on scaffolding in the dark of her world's painted caves, where 40,000 years of her species' art lay layered, era over era, the deep galleries of a people who had never once stopped making images. And when the seams opened and the dawn began to reset, the loop went looking for the strongest grip on Imbri and seated itself. The Corb's diagnostics confirmed, in the only candidate it ever seriously had, the woman whose whole vocation was refusing to let the old images die. A restorer, a professional keeper of other people's vanished hands. The loop knows its own kind. I have stopped being surprised. What Senna Os did with her loops is the part every keeper's story has. The method, the climb, the tower. Imbri's tower fell in good order once the emissaries reached her. The Atlas records it efficiently. What earns the chapter is what she did besides, loop after loop, that no doctrine asked of her, and what it turned out to mean. She painted the resets. From her earliest loops, before the emissaries, before she had words for what was happening, Senna Os responded to the unbearable, as her hands knew how. She went down into the deepest gallery of the great cave system, past the restored eras, to the bare rock beyond the last paintings, and she painted what only she could see. The morning that repeated, the faces of the dead who woke, the seam over the harbor. Loop after loop she descended, and painted the day no one else would remember. And here is the thing, the impossible hinge of the page. The paintings persisted. The dawn reset every object on Imbri. Her brushes were back in their jars, each 614, her scaffolds folded, the world's whole matter rubber-banded, except the paintings in the deep gallery, which accumulated, loop over loop, the only physical objects on the planet to cross the resets. And Cass, when the field reports reached her, went very quiet, and then explained, and the explanation rewrote a corner of everything we thought we knew.
The reset returns matter to its 614 configuration,
She said,
but the loop's machinery must accept the keeper's body, the keeper's memory, whatever the keeper is. Or there is no loop, only a recording. The machinery, in other words, must decide each dawn what counts as part of the keeper. And what Senna Os put on that rock was not pigment in a configuration. 40,000 years of restoration practice, a life's whole vocation, the grief of 200 loops. She was not making pictures of what she carried. She was putting what she carried somewhere else. The paintings read to the loop's machinery, as keeper, Eli. It could not reset them without resetting her. She had found, without theory, without a system, whispering hints, with a brush, the thing your keepsake card did once, at mythic cost, as the rarest object in the worlds. She externalized the ledger. She made the cave the second place, the first backup in the history of the keepers, and she made it out of ochre and carbon black, because the impulse to put the dead on the rock wall, so the dark cannot have them, is older than the hunger, older than the towers. Older. This is what I came to your kitchen to say. Older than me. Her species was doing it 40,000 years before the first seam. Every painted cave on every world was already this. We did not invent the keeping, any of us. We industrialized a thing that was on the walls all along.
The deep gallery of Imbri is a sanctioned pilgrimage now, the only active keeper archive in the worlds that predates its own war, and the pilgrims descend past 40,000 years of ordinary immortality. The bison and the boats and the handprints of children dust for 400 centuries, down to the gallery of the loops, where the war's whole chronicle stands in a restorer's steady strokes. The repeated mourning, 200 renderings, each dated in her private notation. The dead, woken and woken. The emissary's arrival. There is a painting of Set, sitting down, eyes below hers, that the Corps has adopted as its icon. The climb, the tower, the spending of her world's lock. And at the end of the gallery, past the war, in the space her people have agreed will never be painted over, the final image, made in her old age, after the victory, the one Ren could not speak about with the field sketch on my kitchen table. It is a handprint, the oldest gesture in the galleries. The children's handprints upstream are 40,000 years old. One ochre handprint, hers, pressed beside a smaller, fainter one copied with a restorer's exactness from the deepest ancient gallery. Some nameless child's print, 400 centuries gone. And beneath the two hands, in the war notation and in the old tongue both, Senna Os wrote the line that the pilgrims descend 3 miles of dark to stand in front of. The line Imbri gave the atlas as its page's epigraph. The line that is, Ren is right, my whole dissertation, anticipated by 40,000 years, in a cave, by hands that never knew the war was coming and armored their world against it anyway. Image by image, simply because they could not bear to let the loved things go unrecorded. We were here. We held each other. The wall remembers, even when the morning doesn't. Pass it down. Pass it down. The oldest standing order in any world, issued by no command, obeyed in every cave and notebook and margin and atlas page and 800-page last wall that any hand has ever filled, and I read it now, an old restorer of mornings myself, as the final proof of the thing I argued before the light resolved, and have spent 2 lifetimes confirming. The keeping was never the war's invention, and it will not end with the war's veterans. It is the species, all the species. It was always, simply, what hands are for. Chapter 52. Theo, and the children who never looped. I want to come home now, off the atlas, back to the hill, because there is a generation growing up in the new town that did not live through any of this, and they are the whole point of it. And I would be a poor keeper of the dead if I kept only the dead, and not the living who get to be alive because of them. His name is Theo. You have met him, though you did not know it. He is the kid I pulled into the doorway of the bank on the very first morning of the very first loop. The 10-year-old whose hand I held while a bruise-colored thing swung its shadow past. The one I told it's going to be okay, and lied. I did not know his name then. I did not know it across 64 loops. He was just the kid in the bank. One more face in the count. One more name I never learned because there were too many to learn, until the loop that mattered. Selah learned it, on the first true dawn, the way Selah learned everyone's. Theo. He is 14 now, the same age as the boy of Thren, and the symmetry is not lost on me. 2 boys of 14, one who climbed a drowning world's tower alone and forgot his mother's boat, one who grew up safe on a hill that stayed and remembers nothing of the apocalypse at all. Theo does not remember the loops. Of course he doesn't. No one does but me, and I gave mine away, so in a sense Theo and I are the same, 2 people who lived through the end of the world and carry none of it in our own heads. But Theo's not remembering is different from mine, and the difference is the most hopeful thing in the book. I forgot because I gave it away. Theo never knew. He was a child in a bank on a morning that, for him, simply led to other mornings, because by the time he was old enough to understand what had nearly happened, it had already not happened, already been ended, already been turned into a story the grown-ups told. Theo grew up in the first generation in 406 worlds for whom the apocalypse is history, not memory, not trauma, not a wound carried, but a story. The way a war your grandparents fought is a story, real and grave and finished and survived. He asked me about it once. That is the chapter, really. That is the thing I want to keep. He found me on the hill, where I go to sit sometimes, at the old Hearthhold site. We kept it, the original wall, the first sanctuary, as a kind of monument, the dry stone ring where 14 people once stood while the world unmade itself around them. I was sitting on the wall in the evening, and Theo came up, 14 and awkward and brave the way 14 is brave, and he sat down next to me. He pulled up the wall like a second chair, though he didn't know that's what he was doing, and he said, "Mr. Vance, is it true you remember the old times? Before? When the sky used to tear?" "No," I said. "I don't, actually. I used to. I gave it away. To end it. So I know the stories, but I don't remember them. Same as you, really. We're in the same boat, you and me. Two guys who lived through the end of the world and can't remember a minute of it." Theo thought about that. "That's kind of sad," he said, with the directness of 14. "You did the most important thing ever, and you can't even remember it." "Yeah," I said. "It is kind of sad. But here's the thing I've figured out. Sitting on this wall, I looked out over the valley, the town, the lights coming on, the longest table in the hall being set for the evening meal, the world that stayed. I don't remember doing it, but I get to see it. Every day, I get to see you, 14 and safe and asking me annoying questions on a wall, when by every law of 406 worlds, you should have died in a bank when you were 10, with a stranger lying to you about it being okay. My throat did the thing it does. I don't have the memory of saving you, Theo. I gave that away. But I've got the you. The actual you, alive, right here, being a pain in my neck. And it turns out that's better. The memory of saving someone is just a story in your head. The someone, saved, alive, sitting next to you on a wall, that's the real thing. I traded the story for the thing. I'd do it again. I bumped his shoulder. "Even though you ask too many questions." Theo was quiet for a while, in the 14-year-old way that means something is landing. "My mom says," he said finally, "that you knew my name. On the last morning, the real one, that you stood on a bus and said everybody's names, 400 of them, and that's how you got everyone to go to the hill. She says you knew her name, and my name, and that you'd learned them over a lot of times. Times nobody else remembers." He looked at me, and there was something old in his young face, the weight of a thing too big for 14, handled carefully. "You learned my name a bunch of times, over and over, and every time I forgot you, and you did it anyway. For years, for me. And I can't even remember it, so I can't even thank you for it. And you can't remember doing it, so you can't even—" "Theo," I said gently, "listen, you don't thank someone for that by remembering it. Nobody remembers it. That's not where the thanks goes." I stood up off the wall, the old wall, the first sanctuary, and I looked at the kid I'd saved 1,000 times and couldn't recall saving once. "You thank someone for that by doing it for somebody else. That's the only thanks that means anything. Someday you're going to meet someone who needs their name learned. Someone difficult, maybe. Someone who keeps forgetting you, or who's hard to love, or who's outside everybody's wall. And you're going to remember that a guy you can't remember learned your name 1,000 times for nothing, just because you were worth it. And you're going to do the same thing for that person. That's how you thank me. That's how anybody thanks anybody, for any of this." I put my hand on his shoulder. "Pass it on. Learn somebody's name. Pull up a chair. Keep the forge lit. That's the whole inheritance, Theo. That's everything 406 worlds died to figure out. And you get it for free, as a story, because you were born on a world that stayed. Don't waste it. Go learn somebody's name." Theo nodded, slowly, the weight settling into a shape he could carry. And then, because he was 14, and the moment was very large, and 14 can only hold the very large for so long, he said, "Okay, but can you also help me with my actual question, which is that my friend Pilar likes me and I don't know what to do about it?" And I laughed. The first fully unguarded laugh of my new and empty and slowly refilling life. And I sat back down on the wall of the first sanctuary, and I helped a boy I'd saved 1,000 times figure out what to do about a girl whose father had stood the north wall to keep her safe. And the lights came on in the valley, and the table was set, and the world stayed, and stayed, and stayed. That is what we saved it for. Not for me to remember. For Theo to ask me about Pilar on a wall at dusk. That's the whole thing. That was always the whole thing.